Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the second semester of our conversation series focused this term on racial politics and social justice. I'm Dr. Nuria Godón, Associate Professor of Spanish, and along with my colleague, Dr. Alejandra Aguilar, we are the co-organizers of this event. Today, we have the honor to count with Nick Jones, Assistant Professor of Spanish and African Studies at Bucknell University. Dr. Jones, thanks for being here. And we would like also to thank the sponsors that make this talk possible, the Caribbean and Latin American Studies and the Department of Languages, Linguistics, and Comparative Literature. Finally, we want to recognize the support of the Dorothy Smith College of Arts and Letters, the Hispanic Honor Society, Sigma Delta Pi, and our staff, Camela Ibrahim, Jackie Caraza, and Polly Barks for helping us, among other things, with the promotion of this event. I leave you now with Dr. Yolanda Gamboa, who will introduce our guest speaker and conduct the Q&A session. Enjoy the talk.
Hello, welcome. Dr. Nicholas Jones is an assistant professor, soon to be associate professor of Spanish and African Studies at Bucknell University, whose research agenda explores the agency, subjectivity, and performance of Black diasporic identities in early modern Iberia and the Ibero-Atlantic world. He's the author of the award-winning Staging Habla de Negros, Radical Performances of the African Diaspora in Early Modern State, this book, from Penn State University Press. It's a book that's earned several prizes. The 30th Catherine Singer Novak's Prize from the Modern Language Association, and the Outstanding First Book Prize from the Association for the Study of Worldwide African Diaspora. He's also the co-editor of Early Modern Black Diaspora Studies with Cassandra Smith and Miles Grier, and Pornographic Sensibilities with Chad Lee Jones. He's also the co-editor of Routledge, Critical Junctures in Global Early Modernities book series, and the new editor-in-chief of Caribbeana, the Journal of Early Caribbean Society. In this talk, he's gonna talk to us about this new book, where he analyzes the cultural and dramatic representations of Black African voices in Spanish theater. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I express my infinite thanks and gratitude to FAU's Arts and College of Arts and Sciences and Letters for extending this warm, gracious invitation to share my work, and also many thanks to all of the powers that be behind the scenes and constituents for making this event possible and for bringing us all together. So today, I'll be obviously talking about my book, Staging Habla de Negros. But to begin, I would like to, or I will bookend this talk with two short clips. In the first one, I'll begin with just a quick trailer from the Gurumbe documentary directed by Miguel Angel Rosales. And I like beginning this talk particularly with this documentary because it takes us outside of the early modern period, early modern Spain in particular, and raises very germane, important questions about what do we do about the racialization of Blackness in Spain writ large, across time, and in general, as you'll see in this short 2-minute clip, to get a better sense and feel for currently in the 21st century, again, what are the, many of the pressing issues and problematics about Blackness in particular in Spain across time. So I'll begin with this very, very short 2-minute clip, and then I'll begin into my formal talk. Let's see, share. Right.
Disseram dia assim, tu és diferente. E a partir de hoje tu tens que sofrer.
Popularmente, todo el mundo pensaba que en España no hubo esclavos. Yo, solamente para la tesis sobre la Granada del siglo XVI, encontré 2.500 documentos de compraventa de esclavos.
Cuando empecé a componer, iba buscando ese misterio de eso que dicen que hay unos sonidos negros dentro de la música andaluza.
Siendo Sevilla la dueña del universo explorado.
Por Sevilla entran del orden de 90.000 africanos esclavos. Un 10% reembarca para América, pero ¿y los 80.000 restantes?
Los únicos países europeos donde hubo una población negra importante fueron España y Portugal.
De lo que tenemos noticias de la importancia que tienen en los bailes, en la construcción de la fiesta callejera.
Hay algo de lo negro que claramente ha quedado en la cultura andaluza, ¿no? Y en gran medida esas cosas no son materiales, sino son expresivas.
El pueblo también tenía esclavos. Tenían esclavos los mercaderes, tenían esclavos los sacerdotes, todo el mundo tenía esclavos.
En el Caribe afroandaluz se experimentaron muchas cosas y allí en Veracruz hay mucha relación con lo que llaman el fandango indiano.
Y lo negro, sin embargo, se ha extirpado del arte flamenco. El negro es el otro. El negro es el esclavo.
Se produjo una negación sistemática de cualquier vinculación de España con el mundo negro.
En una ciudad como Sevilla apenas existe una memoria de lo que ha sido la presencia africana, la presencia negra en esta ciudad.
Pa' tratarme como me has tratado, antes de quererme me hubiera dejado. Pa' tratarme como me has tratado, antes de quererme me hubiera dejado. Pa' tratarme como me has tratado, antes de quererme me hubiera dejado.
Great. Great. All right. So this afternoon, I will speak about my monograph, Staging Habla de Negros, Radical Performances of the African Diaspora in Early Modern Spain. In this volume, I analyze white appropriations of Black African voices in Spanish theater from the 1500s through the 1700s, when the performance of Africanized Castilian, commonly referred to as Habla de Negros, Black talk or Black speech, was in vogue. Focusing on Spanish Golden Age theater and performative poetry from authors such as Calderón de la Barca, Lope de Rueda, and Rodrigo de Reynosa, I make a strong case for revising the belief long held by literary critics and linguists that white appropriations and representations of Habla de Negros language are racist buffoonery or stereotype. Instead, Staging Habla de Negros shows Black characters who laugh, sing, and shout, ultimately combating the violent desire of white supremacy. By placing early modern Iberia in conversation with discourses on African diaspora studies, I showcase how Black Africans and their descendants who built communities in early modern Iberia were rendered legible in performative literary texts. Staging Habla de Negros posits an alternative interpretation of Habla de Negros speech events that disrupts the critical reception bestowed on literary appropriations of Africanized Castilian. While acknowledging the compelling research conducted by previous scholars, I aim to revise the dominant discourse they have established. My goal here is to highlight the agentive subject positions of Habla de Negros speakers and to examine their voices as viable discourses. This book sets into motion a new scholarly precedent and trend that will place at the forefront a paradigm shift for scholars of Iberian studies, Latin American studies, and African diasporic studies. Although some scholars will contend that it is impossible for any white author of Habla de Negros materials to engage in non-racist characterizations of their Black literary creations, the close readings performed throughout staging Habla de Negros will suggest otherwise. Regardless of the ideologies espoused by these authors, I argue that their texts do, in fact, render legible the voices and experiences of Black Africans in fundamental ways that demand our attention. Rodrigo de Reynosa's Gelofe Mandinga, a poem directed specifically at the Black population of Seville, highlights West African aesthetics and culinary practices. En Lope de Rueda's Eufemia, Los Engañados, and Coloquio de Gila, the Black women who populate these dramatic works intercalated short skits, sass and subvert their interlocutors' racist and misogynist epithets. At the turn of the 17th century in 1602, Simón Ovado's Entremés de los Negros stages the agentive voices of Dominga and Gaspar, who challenged their white masters by interrogating the institution of slavery and its infringement on the marrying of Black slaves. Aguado's play is also a foundational work in early modern Spanish theater studies, for it lays the groundwork for other Spanish authors such as Francisco Avellaneda in his Entremés de los Negros from 1622 and Quevedo's Boda de Negros from 1643 to explore the theme of Black weddings, nuptials, and sub-Saharan African musical traditions and dance in Spain. And even more fascinating are the ways in which practitioners of Habla de Negro speech forms link the language to African dances and music, which I do not treat entirely as a mockery nor an attempt to hypersexualize and denigrate Blacks. Rather, when Spanish dramaturgs incorporate Black dances and musical traditions, such as the guineo, gurumbe, paracumbe, sarabanda, and sarambeque, to name just several, into their plays, a new aesthetic and exploration of African diasporic culture comes alive. If the first argument of staging Habla de Negros is to highlight the agentive subject positions of Habla de Negros speakers in literature, then the second argument of the book claims that Black populations of early modern Iberia actively participated in the formation of a so-called Black experience that thrived outside of Brazil, the Caribbean, and the United States. The contributions of historians such as David Wheat, Erin Kathleen Rao, Gabriel Rocha, Herman Bennett, James Sweet, and Toby Green, among many others, have been instrumental to my theoretical framing of the African diaspora in relation to early modern Iberia. What I have found compelling about their works remains their strength in stressing the centrality of the African past in African diasporic studies. Like them, at different points in time in the generative genesis of their bodies of thought, I also argue that resistance among enslaved Africans did not always manifest itself in the ways that scholars have typically understood their bondage and subordination. And by no means do I fetishize Black people's agency and resistance to oppression. Historically, in early modern Iberia, as well as in the variety of texts I examined throughout this book, Black Africans and their descendants frequently addressed the institution of slavery and its attendant uncertainties and pressures with the most potent weapons at their disposal, not muscle and might, but the materiality of clothing, food, hair, makeup, religion, and spirituality, and song and dance. These performative embodiments of Black expression are deeply embedded in Habla de Negro speech, and I treat them as evidence for Africans addressing their condition. Habla de Negro speech events also manifest physical embodiment through Black dances. In his Pragmática del Tiempo, Francisco de Quevedo berates Black African slave culture flourishing on Spanish soil. What he denigrates in particular is the guineo, a West African dance known for its quick and brisk movements. In his own words, he scoffs, and I'll read the original Castilian and provide the English translation thereafter. Ítem, vista la ridícula figura de los criados cuando dan a beber a sus señores, haciendo el coliseo, el guineo inclinando con notable peligro y asco todo el cuerpo demasiado, y que, siendo mudos de boca, son habladores de pies de puro hacer desairadas reverencias. Declaramos sea eso tenido por descortesía e reverencia. And the English translation, Item, given the ridiculous figure of the servants when they serve drinks to their masters, dancing the coliseo and the guineo, hunching their whole body over in a notably dangerous and disgusting manner, and that, being mute of mouth, they are chatterboxes with their feet. From making so many unattractive reverences, we declare this to be discourteous and irreverent, end quote. As if he were peering in on a masquerade ball or party, Quevedo's satiric commentary in this passage, as well as in the rest of the Pragmática, possesses an ethnographic and folkloric flavor, transporting us to some kind of ritual or folkloric performance, yet also legalistic and inquisitorial, hence the repetition of item throughout the treatise. Quevedo conjures an imagery of a deformed and grotesque Black body, qua coliseo or culiseo, derived from culo or ass, guineo, the dance, and habla de negros, this Black talk, this Africanized Castilian, which we can also read in this context as speech impediment. Quevedo's remark they are chatterboxes with their feet also stems from a larger cultural legacy and history of West Central African dances that traveled to and from the continent of Africa, the Spanish Caribbean, and the Iberian Peninsula. To acquire a fuller understanding of Black dances in early modern Spain, we must go back to early modern continental Africa and colonial Cuba in order to trace these dances' transatlantic maritime journey to Spanish shores. Dance historian and flamenco scholar José Luis Navarro Garcia, in his Historia del Baile Flamenco, explains the indelible imprint of sub-Saharan African dances on Iberian soil. He is the first scholar, to my knowledge, who links sub-Saharan African dances, music, drumming styles, and ceremonial rituals coming from early colonial Cuba to early modern Spain well into the 18th and 19th centuries. Navarro Garcia explains that a variety of African dances, songs, and rhythms crossed the Atlantic from Havana, brought by mariners and other travelers arriving to the ports of Cadiz and Seville. In Seville, for instance, census reports and ecclesiastic records document the large presence of Blacks and mulattoes in attendance of and participation in the Corpus Christi procession that welcomed the Catholic monarch's arrival to the gate of the Macarena on July 24th, 1477. 20 years later, on June 27, 1497, for instance, during Queen Isabella's appearance at Seville's Corpus Christi festivities that summer, the city issued an order requesting that, and I quote, all Blacks in the city, end quote, participate in celebrating the Catholic monarch's arrival. This civic gesture and the historic archive of including and signaling all Blacks in Seville to partake in Sevillana citizenry repeats itself in the early 1500s in Rodrigo de Reynosa's literary archive of Jelofe Mandinga. In the municipal archive of Jerez de la Frontera from Cadiz, complaints circulated in response to predominantly Black parties or fiestas, where Black and white slave fandangueros or partygoers caused a lot of ruckus with their tambourines, barrel drums, and other instruments. And so now I will show the next clip.
Les routes de l'esclavage.
Danza bella cucurumbe, alangandanga cucurumbe, alangandanga cucurumbe. Danza bella cucurumbe, alangandanga cucurumbe. Mantenga signor Gianbranca, mantenga vostra merce, mantenga vostra merce. Sabe come gli anna sera agli alberi, io da padrino. Sabe me, ma verso il nascimento di un pesebre già questa. Sabe me, su vegni vivrà. Su campi senza incolata, Sagarano, Sagara, su Sani con coglio rosso. Sabe me, su alangandanga cucurumbe, danza bella cucurumbe, alangandanga cucurumbe, alangandanga cucurumbe, danza bella cucurumbe, alangandanga
In theorizing the complexity of Black dances in early modern Spain, as signaled in Jordi Saval's staging of Mateo Flecha's La Negría Sansa Bella Gucurumbe, I would like to direct our attention to the lower frequencies that Ralph Ellison famously evoked in Invisible Man. If we are to read these dances as examples of Black communication, then, as Tavia Nyong'o affirms in his essay, Afro-Philosonic Fictions, Black Sound Studies After the Millennium, the radical tradition of Black communication on the lower frequencies is what enables me to challenge Western epistemic illiteracy in the variety of Black dances explored herein that represent most vividly instances in which Black communication and expression manifest in early modern Spain. I turn to an analysis of the lower frequencies in order to make better sense of Western misperceptions of the hypersexuality of these dances, characterized by suggestive hip and pelvic movements, sultry gyration, and the poking and provoking of one's dance partner and audience. The category of the lower frequencies allows us to redirect our focus on the hypersexuality of Black dances and their sounds from the carnal to, instead, the hypervisible and the hyperkinetic. The hypervisibility of Black dances lends itself to the fact of the regularity of their performance and fame. Yet, in haptic, scopic, and visual contexts, dancing Black flesh mesmerized and titillated Spanish audiences, European and African descended alike, and at other times discussed moralists. But I also believe that dances like the sarabanda and the sarambeque also give evidence to the realm of the hyperkinetic, so nicely nuanced in Covarrubias's definition of the sarabanda in his 1611 Tesoro, which highlights the impactful dynamism of these Black dancers in early modern Spanish daily life. As hyperkinetic entities, Black dances not only serve the immediate role of performance, but also anchored on the one hand and connected on the other hand, African diasporic dance culture to Black sounds reverberating on both sides of the Ibero-Atlantic world. To conclude, as I go on to think about early modern Africanized Castilian outside of its early modern periodization, the provocative insights of the French philosophers Deleuze and Guattari in their essay, What is a Minor Literature, reminds me that each of us, as well as back in the early modern period, lives in a language that is not our own. I ask, is the final racial linguistic imprint of literary Habla de Negros solely a marker of the poverty of a language? I think not. A premise on which I stake significant theoretical claims is the belief that just as any standard language, Africanized Castilian represents a transmission of orders, an exercise of power, and resistance to larger hegemonic power structures. Africanized Iberian languages symbolize a tetralinguistic model that encompasses the vernacular, the material, and that which is territorial. spoken out of the mouths of the enslaved. Habla de Negros speech forms are the language variants from their Castilian norm that fill a certain function that cannot be filled by that normal Castilian standard. Thank you.
You can place your questions in the chat.
One question, so while we start, wait for the other participant. So can you hear me right? Yes, okay. So Nick, thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I think it's very enlightening to think again and revisit the archive, because what I really enjoy of your book and your work is how you invite us to revisit the archive. And you also pointed out that the problem is not really the archive, it's our eyes, it's how we really go to the archive and analyze and rethink about these subjectivities or Black subjectivities, how they are overpresent, they are everywhere. But my question is more about the performance part of your work that for me is very interesting. So I don't know if you can maybe elaborate a little bit more what we know or what you have find in the archive about actresses, people that work in the theater, the people that really live in that period of time, and anything that you can elaborate about that. And thank you very much.
No, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Fantastic question. As far as the performance and the performance history of these materials, there, as I discussed in chapter 1, as I discussed in chapter 1 of the book, there were with these performances, there were, as you point out and ask, actual, real Black actors and actresses. And then obviously, on the flip side of that, there weren't. And which is the subject matter and topic of chapter 1 of the book. We get into this whole messiness of racial impersonation and Blackface performance. But to answer your, direct question, yes, there were, Black actors and actresses who, performed, and immediate examples, just thinking about the material and text in the book that, I discuss in Staging Habla de Negros. There's a reference to an obviously a Black woman actress who's from Portugal, who performed in con Villa Mediana's Flor de Niquea, and during the court of Philip IV, particularly in the palace of Aranjuez. And so there's a huge, production of that particular, of that work. And there's a particular role of this, where this Black actress who's young, we don't know her age, but it's understood that she was, younger. And she played the role of the night, of like the noche de la noche, of the night. And there's this commentary of her voice being sonorous and excellent, so on and so forth. Also in that same text, there's references to the mulatto Soplillo, who in the Prado, there's a painting by Villandrando, Philip IV, Felipe IV, with Soplillo. And so with this, particular guy, this person, it's understood that he was like the escudo, the shield, and carried this type of, object and prop in the play. Let's see what else. Also much later, around 1694, there's also references. And again, as far as the performance history, I don't know if this particular actor, if there was an actual Black actress who, did this role, performed the role. But in 1694, there's an understudied piece by Calderón de la Barca called La Negra. And so that's one piece that immediately comes to mind. Also, again, thinking about Cervantes as well in his prologue to the Ocho Comedias y Entremeses and such. He fondly, Cervantes fondly reminisces and thinks back of watching Lope de Rueda perform all of these different, characters, from ruffians, Black women, so on and so forth, the varieties of characters that, we find and see in Comedia studies. Those are like the immediate examples that come to mind. And even in performative poetry, and the point that I explicitly make with Reynosa's coplas, his Gelofe Mandinga, the opening rubric from the Pliego says explicitly that these coplas, that this material, that this text is dedicated to the Black men and women of Seville. And so when we flip that and think about audience, I think that that's also another foil and another way to think about your excellent question with actors and who are, the real performers. A point that I impress upon in staging Habla de Negros is that, that we need to revise and tread carefully about assuming that the audience was always this monolithic white audience, which is for me very problematic and not true. And there's so many ways to think about what that audience, what the audience was, so on and so forth. Another example that comes to mind, going back to like real Black actors, real Black people, would be in Portugal. And in Portugal, there are many more examples and cases of where we find this. And so the Italian travel writer Sassetti documents and observes and writes, having seen Blacks speak in Habla de Negros and perform in these public spaces. So that's another example that comes to mind. And even thinking nowadays, as I kind of reflect back and think about, the book and things that, always, you wish you would have done, or things to add. A lot of the great work that, Esther Fernandez is doing, Barbara Fuchs is doing in Comedia Studies, and Margaret Boyle as well with Comedia Studies, and thinking about reproductions, like present day reproductions. And there's there's just like so much to do, to think about and to explore with how in Spain particularly, again, there are theater troupes and theatrical structures, if you will, thinking about Almagro and others, and others as well, whose names are escaping me right now. But there are productions that cast and are making a better conscious effort to cast more in a way that's, inclusive, mindful of the ethnic racial representation of the time. And so, and again, I'm not saying that it's perfect, and of course there's still, when you think about in Spain currently with the Black View, which is an organization, that a collective of Black and African descended Spaniards and actors who would clearly, present and argue, otherwise. There's still a lot of work to be done, and there's still, nowadays forms of, discrimination and so on and so forth that happen in this sphere of acting, and not necessarily in the comedia, but when we think about movies, the casting for movies and television series, so on and so forth. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. But the question that you ask, Alejandra, is so germane to and it's, you know, it's an important one and a necessary one that has implications and ramifications for our, you know, what's happening nowadays on the ground.
Thank you very much, Nick.
Yeah.
And we have some questions right now. And what you said about Spain, that's from Manuel Delgado. What you said about Spain, Seville can be applied to southern Italy, more concretely to Sicily.
Great, no, excellent question. That's a great question. I'm not sure. I don't want to, you know, lie and say that it was the same, but I think that there's something definitely operative in this Mediterranean world in the early modern period that, using Iberia as a case study, we can do comparative or not studies and analyses, and even recently, just thinking about the representation of early modern Blackness in Italy. You know, there's scholars, you know, working in, you know, literary critics and scholars in Italy, by the name, there's one who comes to mind, Gianfranco Salvatore, if I'm not mistaken, who's doing excellent work on the Canuri and very similar representations of Africanized Italian, and specifically from like Africanized Neapolitan speech, or from Napoli. Some really terrific, great work. Also thinking about, within the case of Italy and early modern Blackness, when we think about opera studies and the sonic and opera and the castrati, and Emily Wilburn is a colleague of mine whose work is really excellent, thinking about Blackness and race, and she's a musicologist, but thinking about, you know, those types of questions of performance and marked speech. And yeah, so that's the immediate type of answer that I would give.
I think one doesn't think right away of that time period full of Blacks, and it's amazing that you know, and I was thinking how many, or what would the percentage be at the time period? Seville, I mean, and all the other areas of Spain as well, you think, or it was mostly concentrated in the south?
I would say, no, I would say, I mean, definitely, as far as numbers and demographics, I mean, the running consensus among historians is that in the 16th century, in Seville, and both Seville and Lisbon, there's a running number of 11%. You have some historians who push that percentage a tad higher to 15%. But again, the general consensus of the Black population in both Lisbon and Seville at the height of the Renaissance was 10 to 11%. And then definitely thinking about the movements, obviously Portugal and Lisbon and Seville being kind of the epicenters, if you will. Clearly, you know, Madrid, all the larger other important cities, there's movement. Also, when we think about port cities, that's also extremely important in our analysis and historical thinking, if you will. Valencia, Barcelona, all the really important, outside of Andalusia, I mean, you know, thinking about Catalonia and Aragon as well. And even that's like an interesting fact, historical fact, thinking about Aragon with sodomy cases. Aragon has one of the sodomy cases where some Black men, but mulattoes, are prosecuted and sentenced, or many are coming from Aragon. There's evidence of that type of material in the archive. So those numbers are interesting to think about and trace.
And did you find evidence of Black, Iberian, or African playwrights creating complete works in Iberia?
In Portugal, yes. In Portugal, there's one. Obviously, in the Castilian context, we have one Latino. That, as far as actual, black black person who's writing and publishing and such. Even and this information I reference in the intro from Staging Habla de Negros, but even in there's one essay in the writer, forgive me, the authors' names are escaping me, but there is evidence of specifically in Spain with or not necessarily with Habla de Negros, but of Black people who, through apprenticeship, whether it's through in the monastic tradition, in royal palaces, who were trained and who learn and go under, or apprentices, who learn how to write. But as far as in Portugal, definitely there's one on particular. I have to find the name and I can follow up with that particular person. And the interesting thing with this particular playwright from Portugal is that he, in his plays, Africanized Portuguese or the Fala de Preto isn't represented. However, racially marked or linguistically marked Arab speeches, or the speech of the Moriscos and such, he does in those plays, he does write and mark that speech. But interestingly enough, for the Black voices, he doesn't do that. So, and I can follow up with those sources, but yeah.
And actually, reading your book, I was thinking, you made me think about the early iconography of King Balthazar.
Yes.
And I think that's a good point. When did you think about why, in a way, how it exists? That it's a very positive figure, because I mean, some children even prefer King Balthazar to the others. How is it? How does it appear? When does it appear in the Middle Ages? Maybe to represent the otherness within. You kind of raised the question, but you didn't answer, and I was wondering, have you thought about it from then?
Yeah. Oh boy. Yeah. Honestly, I mean, I haven't, but yeah, that's the number. Yeah, that's another. Yeah, very contentious. Depending on how you reply, people will, attack you and jump on you. But I don't think, I mean, kind of playing devil's advocate here, and being shrewd in my response, I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think that there are multiple ways to think about, to provide an answer to that. There's so many different, again, depending on your own, convictions and where one positions himself, with regard to race, especially now and more so recently. I think in early modern in medieval Iberia with Auto de los Reyes Magos, it's something different. And as I say in the book, I do believe that there's something different, operating and at work, but most definitely in these more contemporary, 19th century contemporary thereafter, representations, obviously clearly forms of blackface and such, requires, a different type of critical lens. And again, even more recently, within the past, I don't know, maybe 5 years or so, in Madrid. And as a matter of fact, so we're in 2021. So I want to say, a year ago, before COVID, before all this COVID stuff happened, I was in, in Madrid during the time of Los Reyes Magos, and Baltasar was an actual, Black man who was, being performed. So going back to Alejandra's question, bit by bit, we're seeing, changes in a more in tune, responsible, if you will, for lack of a better word, with respect to, hiring practices, casting and such. So.
Yolanda, may I jump in? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Nick, thank you very much for your wonderful talk. I have a question actually regarding your third chapter where you work on Black female characters. And I was wondering if you think one can establish a connection between these Black divas and Las Pícaras, like Justina.
Oh, absolutely.
I think it's very interesting because like the characters that you're describing, Yomari, Eulala, there's a self-fashioning through material culture, but also a performativity through their language that allows them to have a peculiar voice. And I was thinking if when you follow the classical already commonplace of the picaresque development, Lazarillo, Guzman, and then you have something like Justina, who is like what it means to be a pícaro, self-assumed pícaro, what genders does to that construction. I wonder if we can establish a link between Justina, Teresa, Manzanares, Elena, la hija de la Celestina, those characters and these Black females, what race does to that configuration, right? The same way, like when you think about a pícara, what gender brings to the table, what race brings to the table, and I thought it was very interesting, especially because one of the things that I love about your chapter that you bring the question about policing female bodies, and it's something that is very constant in those texts that present pícaras. Like you have them announcing, uttering their own voice, but all of a sudden their external voices limiting the meaning of what they are trying to convey.
No, absolutely. I mean, what you just said, I definitely spot on. There are numerous possibilities to explore and to unpack, and again, even with during the period, the racialization of Blackness again as a category is isn't always one that's always fixed and rigid. And what I mean by that is there are different modes of, or for the non-Black or African descended characters, or in your case pícaras, there are different ways in which racialization maps out and doesn't always neatly, and I'm agreeing with you, it doesn't always, when you have these different triads of Black, non-white, types of pícaras and characters, the dynamics, the racially gendered dynamics map out in really interesting ways that for me don't necessarily neatly or squarely translate into these binarized Black versus white versus Black constructions. So yeah, I would definitely, absolutely, there's a lot that's going on there for sure.
Michael, want to go ahead with your question?
Sure. So thank you, Nick. This is a great talk and a great conversation. So I wanted to take us back to some of you touched on some of the performative aspects, I think, manuscripts of the plays, of the comedias, and wondered if, sometimes we see in Marginale where actors have added something to the playwright's original text, or we believe the actors had things to do with the way that the text evolved. And I wondered if that's a way to get at what you are calling lower frequencies of African agency in these plays? Did you see anything like that in your archival work, or if you could speak to that perhaps?
For sure, no, great. Immediately, no, I have. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I never. Yeah, thought about it in that ways, and as far as marginalia, I have in the materials that I've worked with, particularly with staging out of the Negros. I didn't come across anything like that, but the closest would be, and it might not be, where you're going, or what you're thinking about, but the closest, going back to blackface performance, and it's not marginalia per se, but these types of corrections and this hyper awareness, particularly again, so with blackface performances, you'll have, and this kind of goes back to Medardo's question, with kind of like these racial triads, if you will, you'll have on a stage, in these performances, where you'll have a white character who's blackened up, and then you'll have an actual black actor, and then you'll have a white actor. And so in this weird type, very weird triad, you'll have either the black actor or a white actor contradicting and saying that this blackface performance isn't necessary. So there's in a lot of this happens in the teatro menor. Usually, from what I found in the standard, Lope, after 1695, when Lope streamlines, the comedia, if you will, in the 3 acts, that I haven't seen that type of stuff happening, which doesn't mean that it, wasn't happening. But in particularly, there's a lot of really cool, contradictory, messy, convoluted things happening with respect to performance and hyper awareness in the teatro menor, in the teatro breve, the mojigangas, the loas, the jacaras, the different bailes, entremeses, and such. And there's tons of them, and even when I'm like working on new things, you think with these Habla de Negros materials, you think that, you've covered it all, and then all of a sudden this, new documents and new texts come up and pop up. So it's infinite. These texts are infinite. It's crazy.
I found it fascinating that your comment about the fact that the dances you were speaking of had traveled to the Americas and then back to Iberia, I think you said Cuba, and then back.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, how are you tracing that? Just, it's an interesting transatlantic journey.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, for me, during this period, there, with these, again, transatlantic maritime journeys and movements, there's, a lot of, again, material, whether it's, a dance or products, agriculture, so on and so forth, that were, moving. And for me, my approach or analysis is one that is generous with that movement. And what I mean by generous, we kind of have to give that traveling and that movement the benefit of the doubt, in the sense that these, again, practices, and in the case of these dances, again, were in flux. They weren't stagnant, they weren't fixed. And there was something, and then also in a lot of the work, Fernando Ortiz is really useful and helpful. And again, Fernando Ortiz has, tons of, and just encyclopedic knowledge of these examples and instances, cases of these types of movements, whether it's in his Negros Curros, Negros Brujos, all that type of those works in that genre of writing. And then even going back to Portugal as well, dances, thinking about the Paracumbe, for example, in Bailes de Angola, that are, I wouldn't say exclusively or singularly Portuguese, but through, again, the movements and close contacts between those two places, and clearly with the slave trading that was happening and the trafficking in the 16th century, there's a lot of cross-pollination, and not necessarily cross-pollination of European into or through African, but a type of African to African, if you will, cross-pollination of cultural production, expressions, linguistic expression, so on and so forth.
I have a question. The song, that beautiful, the song that you put in a clip, is that from archives? Is that something that had to do with slave songs in the time period?
Yeah, so that's comes from the So it comes from the villancico tradition with the villancicos. Actually the composer is from, thinking about Aragon, from Aragon, and so it's from the villancico tradition, these nativity carols, and the protagonist being a Black woman, if you will, and talking about this flower blossoming and so on and so forth. So it comes from the villancico tradition.
Let's see. Okay. Somebody just said they're working on the dissertation about the contemporary representation of Afro-Españoles and Africans in Spanish film and literature. Could you talk about this Black Actors Association? Black Actors Association.
Oh boy, so let me, so I can probably multitask and put the information in the chat, actually. One sec. One good thing about Zoom, because I can find it immediately. So the person who asked the question can I think, oh no, sorry. But still, while I'm finding the information, so Concha Buica's brother, Armando, he runs and leads this, it's an organization group of Black and African descended actors in Spain. And so this group has been, from my understanding, been very vocal and with respect to, obviously, calling out various discriminatory practices, so on and so forth, with casting, and even the hypocrisy and fallacies of colorblind casting, so on and so forth. But on the other hand, on the flip side, it's a fantastic organization because it serves as a unit that gets Black actors and actresses connected, different forms of mentorship, training, so on and so forth. And the thing is that they're all classically trained actors and actresses. They could easily be the lead or the a galan or whatever, a dama in whatever classical standard comedia, but obviously, for obvious reasons and such, that's, not the case. And I know that Jeffrey Coleman in his book, Jeffrey Coleman would know much more about this, than I would, because that's his immediate, wheelhouse and area of expertise. And also Michelle Murray as well at Vanderbilt, who are working on Blackness and Black Spaniards in the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries. So if you're if you're gonna cite anyone, definitely their work and such. And also thinking about, I just reviewed an excellent edited collection by Rosalia Cornejo Parriego, who's at the University of Ottawa. And she curated a beautiful, excellent edited volume that essentially places Black Spain and contemporary Spain in conversation with the United States, particularly with the Harlem Renaissance. And there are three, if I'm not mistaken, there are three parts. And so one of the parts looks at, again, Blackness and the racialization of Blackness in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. There's another section on music in the Jazz Age, and a really cool chapter about Josephine Baker. And so there's a lot of, and I can throw those in the chat quickly, but yeah, those I would definitely start with those three sources.
Thank you very much. I think we're reaching close to the time. We want to continue talking to you, but
See, I think that it's time to wrap up the event. Thank you very much, Nick, for this wonderful presentation. I think you really invite us to rethink what we call Black performance, but also Black subjectivities. And I really enjoy so much your presentation. I invite everybody to read the book that is already in the chat, all the information. And also thank you all for being here today for this wonderful conversation. And I'm gonna just let you know about our last guest speaker, that is going to be Dr. Celso Castillo from Vanderbilt University. Dr. Castillo will present on Wednesday, March the 31 at 2 p.m. So I hope to see you all there. And his presentation is titled Breaking the Silence, the Black Press, Abolition and Brazilian Citizenship, circa 1876. So that is going to be our last presentation for our conversation this semester. We are really, really happy and honored to have Dr. Jones today with us, and you all here sharing with us this wonderful presentation. So thank you very much, and hope to see you here at the end of March. Thank you.
Thanks, Alejandra. Thanks, Yolanda, Nuria. And Nick, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you all.
Great.
Yeah, we are going to be in touch. Thank you very much. Bye.
Yes, talk about